Poor student married 71-year-old millionaire woman. 7 days later, he was shocked by what he saw. Ethan Parker was no stranger to hardship. At just 22 years old, he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. With his mother battling a life-threatening illness and student loan debts piling up like a mountain, the walls of his world seemed to be closing in. Every day was a fight to survive, juggling classes, part-time jobs, and the constant dread of not knowing how he'd make it through tomorrow. One day, while scrolling aimlessly through job boards, something unusual caught his eye. A wealthy widow, Margaret Whitmore, 71 years old, was seeking a companion for what was described as a temporary marriage. The post was explicit. She wanted companionship during her final days and was willing to provide financial security in exchange. At first, Ethan scoffed. The idea was absurd. Marriage to a stranger, let alone someone 49 years his senior, seemed unthinkable. But as the medical bills mounted and the eviction notice loomed, desperation began to cloud his judgment. Ethan's mother, his only family, needed surgery, and time was running out. Margaret's offer wasn't just tempting, it was a lifeline. After days of internal debate, he reached out. The meeting was set for the next evening at Margaret's grand estate, a stark contrast to Ethan's cramped apartment. She greeted him with a warm smile, her presence radiating wisdom and dignity. "I don't need love, Ethan," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. "I need companionship. In return, I'll ensure your debts are erased and your mother gets the care she needs." Ethan's heart raced. Could he do this? Could he set aside his pride and marry someone he barely knew? The thought of his mother, bedridden and in pain, gave him his answer. A week later, Ethan stood at the altar exchanging vows with Margaret in a small, private ceremony. As he slipped the ring onto her frail finger, a mix of guilt and relief washed over him. This wasn't a fairy tale, it was a transaction. But what Ethan didn't realize was that this decision would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Ethan Parker was no stranger to hardship, but stepping into Margaret Whitmore's world was like stepping into another dimension. The grandeur of her mansion, a sprawling estate with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a view of rolling hills, felt almost alien to him. For someone who had spent his entire life in tiny apartments with leaky faucets and paper-thin walls, this new environment was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Margaret herself was unlike anyone Ethan had ever met. Despite her age, there was a vitality in her sharp blue eyes and the way she carried herself. She wasn't frail, as he had imagined a woman in her 70s would be. Instead, she exuded confidence and grace, her every movement deliberate and meaningful. Her voice was soft but firm, and her words carried the weight of someone who had lived a life full of triumphs and heartbreaks. On their first evening together, over a dinner served on fine china Ethan was almost too nervous to touch, Margaret began to open up. She told him about her early years, how she had built her real estate empire from the ground up in a time when women in business were far from the norm. Her marriage to her husband, Richard, had been the love of her life. Together, they had one son, Thomas, a bright, ambitious young man whose life was cut tragically short in a car accident. "My son would have been your age," she said, her gaze fixed on her wine glass. "He was everything to me." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure what Margaret wanted from him beyond companionship, but as she spoke, he began to understand that their arrangement wasn't just about money. Margaret was a woman who had lost everything that mattered to her, and now, at the end of her life, she was searching for meaning in whatever time she had left. The conversation shifted to Ethan. Hesitant at first, he shared bits of his story. His mother's illness, his father's abandonment, the mountain of student loans he had taken on just to stay in school. Margaret listened intently, nodding at all the right moments, her expression softening as he spoke. "You've been through so much," she said. "And yet, here you are. That's strength, Ethan. Don't ever forget that." Her words struck a chord in him. For so long he had felt like life was something that happened to him, a series of burdens he had to endure, but for the first time someone saw him as more than his circumstances. Over the next few days, Ethan began to settle into his new role. Margaret introduced him to the routines of her life, from the morning walks in the garden to the afternoons spent reading in the sunroom. She showed him her late husband's study, a room she hadn't opened in years, and handed him a dusty journal filled with sketches and notes her son had left behind. "This is what's left of him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've kept it all these years, but I think it's time to share it with someone who might understand." Ethan flipped through the pages, his heart aching at the dreams that would never be realized. Thomas had wanted to be an architect just like Ethan. He had sketched designs for buildings that merged beauty and functionality, his passion evident in every line. The connection wasn't lost on Ethan. He felt an unspoken bond with Thomas, a man he would never meet but who now felt like a part of his story. Margaret's trust in him, her willingness to share something so personal, began to shift his perception of their relationship. What had started as a transactional arrangement was becoming something far more complicated. Still, there were moments when Ethan questioned Margaret's motives. She avoided certain topics, like her health or the future of her estate, and often retreated to her private study for hours at a time. There was a sadness about her that she never fully explained, a weight she carried in silence. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Margaret turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "What are your dreams, Ethan?" He hesitated, unsure how to answer. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to dream. Survival didn't leave much room for ambition, but something about the way Margaret looked at him, with genuine curiosity and no judgment, made him open up. "I've always wanted to be an architect," he admitted. "I love the idea of creating something that lasts, something people can use and appreciate for generations. But I don't think it'll ever happen, not with everything going on." Margaret's eyes lit up. "Why not? You have the talent, the drive. Don't let your circumstances dictate your future." Her belief in him was both inspiring and unsettling. For years, he had buried his dreams, convincing himself they were unattainable. Hearing someone else voice their faith in him forced him to confront the possibility that he might have been wrong. But there was still a lingering doubt in the back of his mind. Why had Margaret chosen him? Out of all the people in the world, why had she decided to spend her final days with a struggling student she barely knew? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her decision than she was letting on. 7 days into their marriage, Ethan's suspicions were confirmed. That morning, he found a sealed envelope on his nightstand, addressed to him in Margaret's elegant handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it, the weight of her words sinking into him like stones in water. Ethan stared at the letter in disbelief. Margaret's elegant handwriting filled the page, every word carrying an emotional weight he wasn't prepared for. "Ethan, by the time you read this, you'll have begun to wonder why I brought you into my life. The truth is simple and yet complex. I didn't need a companion. I needed a reminder of the good still left in this world. Your kindness, your perseverance despite life's hardships, and your unwavering dedication to your mother made me believe that I could leave this world with a little more peace. I have made arrangements for the majority of my wealth to be donated to causes close to my heart, including a scholarship fund for students like you, those who dare to dream but lack the means to pursue those dreams. I know this may feel like a betrayal, and I won't ask you to forgive me. But know this, the time I've spent with you has been a gift, one I will cherish until my final breath. You have more strength than you realize, Ethan. Use it. Yours, Margaret." Ethan's hands shook as he finished reading. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He wasn't sure what he felt: anger, confusion, sadness, or a mix of all three. He had entered this arrangement under the assumption that her wealth would solve his problems. Now, it felt like the rug had been pulled out from under him. If you are enjoying the story till now, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue. He stormed into the library, where Margaret was seated by the window, a book in her lap. She looked up, her expression calm but expectant. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan demanded, holding up the letter. "You said you'd help me, but instead you've given everything away." Margaret closed her book and folded her hands in her lap. "Because helping you isn't just about money, Ethan. It's about showing you that you don't need to rely on others to create a meaningful life." Ethan's frustration boiled over. "That's easy for you to say. You've had money your entire life. You've never had to choose between paying rent and buying food or watching someone you love suffer because you couldn't afford their treatment." Margaret's gaze softened, but she didn't waver. "You're right, Ethan. I haven't lived your life, but I faced my own hardships, ones money couldn't fix. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that true strength comes from within." Ethan clenched his fists, unable to find the words to argue. He felt betrayed, as though the fragile trust they had built over the past week had been shattered. Without another word, he turned and left the room, retreating to the greenhouse. There, surrounded by Margaret's orchids, he let his emotions take over. He had been so focused on the promise of financial security that he hadn't considered what Margaret truly wanted from him. Was she testing him? Teaching him? Or was this simply her way of making peace with her own life? The next morning, Ethan avoided Margaret, choosing instead to wander the estate. He found himself drawn to the study where her son's journal still sat on the desk. Flipping through the pages, he noticed a recurring theme in Thomas's sketches: homes designed for people who had nothing. The notes in the margins detailed ideas for affordable housing, community centers, and shelters. It hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Margaret's decision to donate her wealth wasn't just about charity. It was about honoring her son's legacy. She wasn't abandoning him. She was entrusting him with something far more important. That evening, Margaret approached him in the garden. She looked more fragile than usual, her steps slower, her breath labored. Yet her eyes still held that unwavering strength. "I know you're angry," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And I won't pretend to understand what you're feeling. But Ethan, if there's one thing I've learned in my 71 years, it's that life is about more than what we take. It's about what we give." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the sense of betrayal. But her words resonated with a part of him he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. Over the next few days, their relationship began to shift. Ethan still felt the sting of her decision, but he couldn't deny the wisdom in her actions. Margaret's health continued to decline, and Ethan found himself stepping into the role of caregiver. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments, helped her with daily tasks, and spent hours by her side as she shared stories of her past. In those moments, Ethan began to see Margaret not as a millionaire or a benefactor, but as a person, a woman who had faced unimaginable loss and still found the strength to keep going. One afternoon, as they sat in the greenhouse, Margaret handed him a small box. Inside was a key. "This is for the study," she said. "There's something in there I want you to have." Curious, Ethan returned to the study and unlocked a drawer he hadn't noticed before. Inside was a collection of letters, all addressed to him. Each one detailed a piece of Margaret's life, from her childhood dreams to her greatest regrets. In one letter, she wrote about her decision to create the scholarship fund. "I wanted my legacy to be about more than wealth," she had written. "I wanted it to be about hope." As he read through the letters, Ethan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Margaret wasn't trying to teach him a lesson or test his character. She was giving him a chance to see the world through her eyes. And in doing so, she had given him the courage to dream again. By the time he finished, the anger and resentment he had felt toward her were replaced by something else entirely: gratitude. Ethan's resentment toward Margaret had transformed into quiet introspection, but the weight of her decisions lingered heavily. The scholarship fund and her letters revealed a woman whose life had been defined by loss, and yet she chose to give back to the world. Ethan couldn't help but wonder, what would he have done in her place? Margaret's health was deteriorating rapidly. What began as occasional fatigue turned into long hours spent in bed, her once lively conversations replaced by whispered words and faint smiles. Ethan stayed by her side, conflicted yet devoted. The woman he had married for money had become something far more important to him: a mentor, a guiding light, even a friend. One evening, as they sat together in her bedroom, Margaret gestured for Ethan to sit closer. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely audible, "there's one last thing I need you to do for me." He leaned in, his heart pounding. "Anything." In the study, there's a safe behind the painting of the magnolia tree. The code is 1967. Inside, you'll find a folder marked Legacy. Promise me you'll look at it when I'm gone. Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't want to think about losing her, not now, not when he was finally beginning to understand her, but he nodded, squeezing her hand. "I promise." Margaret smiled, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You've been a gift, Ethan, more than you'll ever know." The following days were a blur. Margaret's condition worsened, and the mansion was filled with the quiet hum of hospice care. Ethan rarely left her side, his days revolving around ensuring her comfort. Each moment felt both fleeting and eternal, a strange paradox that left him emotionally drained. Then, one morning, it happened. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, her hand resting in Ethan's. The stillness of the room was suffocating, the weight of her absence pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He sat there for what felt like hours, holding her hand, his mind racing with memories of their brief but profound time together. The funeral was a small, private affair. Margaret had no surviving family, and most of her friends had passed long before her. As the officiant spoke of her generosity and resilience, Ethan felt a pang of guilt. How had he ever doubted her intentions? She had given him more than money. She had given him a new perspective on life. After the service, Ethan returned to the mansion. The silence was deafening, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the life that had once filled the space. He found himself in the study, staring at the magnolia painting Margaret had mentioned. Taking a deep breath, he removed the frame, revealing the safe behind it. His hands trembled as he entered the code. Inside was the folder she had described, along with a single envelope labeled "To Ethan." He opened the envelope first, Margaret's handwriting greeting him one last time. "Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm no longer with you, but know that I left this world at peace thanks to you. The folder contains the plans for a foundation I've started in my son's name. It's my final gift, not just to him, but to you as well. I've left you the role of executor. I trust you to carry out my wishes and to honor Thomas's legacy. I know this isn't the future you envisioned when you married me, but I hope you'll see it as an opportunity, a chance to make a difference. You once told me about your dream of being an architect. I hope this foundation will give you the chance to build something even greater, a legacy of hope and compassion. With all my love, Margaret." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he read her words. The folder contained detailed plans for the foundation, which would provide scholarships, mentorship programs, and community housing projects. It was an ambitious vision, one that Margaret had spent years crafting, and now she was entrusting it to him. Ethan felt overwhelmed. He had entered this marriage out of desperation, never imagining it would lead to something so meaningful. But Margaret's faith in him, her belief in his potential, gave him the strength to take on the challenge. Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into the work of bringing Margaret's vision to life. He met with lawyers, financial advisors, and community leaders, each step solidifying his commitment to the foundation. At times, the task felt insurmountable, but he kept Margaret's letters close, drawing strength from her words. One particularly challenging day, Ethan visited the greenhouse for a moment of solace. As he sat among the orchids, he realized how much he had changed. The man who had once been consumed by survival was now driven by purpose. Margaret's influence had transformed him, not through wealth, but through her unwavering belief in his ability to make a difference. The foundation's launch was a modest but heartfelt event. Ethan stood at the podium, addressing a small crowd of donors, students, and community members. As he spoke about Margaret's life and her dream of leaving the world a better place, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. "She taught me that life isn't about what we take," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It's about what we give, and through this foundation, we'll continue her legacy, one act of kindness at a time." The audience erupted in applause, but Ethan's focus was on the sky where he imagined Margaret watching over him. In that moment, he realized that her greatest gift wasn't the foundation or the opportunities it provided. It was the lesson that even the smallest acts of compassion could create ripples that changed lives. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of responsibility began to settle on Ethan's shoulders. Margaret's foundation, named the Thomas Whitmore Hope Fund, was a beautiful tribute to her late son, but managing it was no small task. Every decision felt monumental, every meeting a reminder of how much was at stake. Ethan threw himself into the work, determined to honor Margaret's trust in him. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, reviewing scholarship applications, meeting with donors, and planning community housing initiatives. Yet, as fulfilling as the work was, it also came with its challenges. One afternoon, Ethan received an email from a journalist requesting an interview about the foundation. While the prospect excited him, the email's closing line made his stomach churn. "We've also heard rumors questioning your motivations for marrying Margaret Whitmore. Care to comment?" Ethan stared at the screen, his chest tightening. It wasn't the first time someone had implied he married Margaret for her money. The whispers had started shortly after her funeral, and though Ethan tried to ignore them, they lingered like a shadow over his every achievement. The journalist's email forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. To many, he was just a poor student who had exploited an old woman's loneliness for financial gain. No one saw the truth of their relationship, the bond they had formed, the lessons she had taught him, the way she had transformed his life. Ethan decided to accept the interview, not to defend himself, but to share Margaret's story. Sitting in front of the camera, he spoke candidly about her life, her losses, and her dream of leaving a meaningful legacy. He described her strength, her wisdom, and the profound impact she had on him. "She didn't just give me a second chance at life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She taught me what it means to truly live. This foundation isn't about me, it's about her and the hope she inspired in so many." The interview aired a week later, and while some viewers remained skeptical, many were moved by Ethan's sincerity. Donations to the foundation increased, and several scholarship recipients came forward to share how Margaret's generosity had changed their lives. But not everyone was supportive. Ethan began receiving anonymous messages accusing him of manipulating Margaret. Some threatened to investigate her estate, claiming he had coerced her into leaving the foundation in his care. The accusations hurt, not because they were true, but because they tarnished Margaret's memory. Ethan turned to the letters Margaret had left him, searching for solace. One in particular stood out. "Ethan, the world will always have its doubts. People will question your intentions, your actions, and your worth. But remember this. The only truth that matters is the one you know in your heart. Stay true to yourself, and you will find your way." Her words were a balm to his wounded spirit. Ethan realized that he couldn't control what others thought of him, but he could control how he responded. He channeled his frustration into his work, pouring his energy into the foundation's first major project, a community center for underprivileged families. The center, named Margaret's Haven, became a symbol of resilience and hope. It offered everything from after-school programs to job training workshops, providing a lifeline to those who needed it most. Ethan personally oversaw the construction, working closely with architects and volunteers to ensure every detail reflected Margaret's vision. On the day of the center's grand opening, Ethan stood in front of a crowd of community members, donors, and volunteers. As he prepared to cut the ribbon, he couldn't help but feel Margaret's presence beside him. The doubts and accusations no longer mattered. What mattered was the impact they were making, the lives they were changing. The ribbon fell, and the crowd erupted in applause. Ethan spent the day meeting families, listening to their stories, and watching as children explored the new playground. It was a moment of pure joy, a reminder of why he had taken on this responsibility in the first place. But just as things seemed to be settling into place, another challenge arose. A distant relative of Margaret's, someone Ethan had never met, filed a legal claim against the foundation. They argued that Margaret had been coerced into her decisions and that her estate should be divided among her surviving relatives. The lawsuit threatened to halt the foundation's operations, freezing its accounts and putting its projects on hold. Ethan was devastated. Everything he had worked for, everything Margaret had envisioned, was at risk of being undone. He sought the advice of Margaret's longtime lawyer, a kind but shrewd man named Charles Whitaker. "This will be a tough battle," Charles warned. "But I believe in you, Ethan. Margaret trusted you for a reason, and we'll fight this together." The legal proceedings were grueling, filled with accusations and counter-arguments. Ethan found himself questioning whether he had the strength to keep going, but every time he felt like giving up, he thought of Margaret, her faith in him, her unwavering belief that he could carry on her legacy. In a surprising twist, one of the scholarship recipients came forward to testify. A young woman named Clara, who had used her scholarship to become a nurse, spoke passionately about how Margaret's generosity had saved her life. "Margaret Whitmore didn't just give me money," Clara said in court. "She gave me hope, and Ethan Parker has continued that legacy, helping countless others like me. If anyone deserves to carry out her wishes, it's him." Her testimony turned the tide. The court ruled in favor of the foundation, allowing its work to continue. Ethan felt a wave of relief, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. The fight had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it had also solidified his commitment to Margaret's vision. As he left the courthouse, Ethan looked up at the sky, whispering a quiet thank you to Margaret. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. The legal victory invigorated Ethan, but it also left him with a profound sense of the responsibility he bore. Margaret's foundation was no longer just an idea. It was a lifeline for hundreds of people, a beacon of hope that carried her name and her legacy. Ethan realized that this wasn't just about fulfilling her wishes. It was about honoring her belief in him and proving to himself that he was worthy of the trust she had placed in him. The first major project after the court ruling was a series of affordable housing units in a struggling neighborhood. Margaret had envisioned homes that weren't just functional but also beautiful, places that would give families pride and dignity. Ethan immersed himself in the project, working closely with architects, planners, and the community itself to ensure every detail was perfect. As construction neared completion, Ethan was invited to speak at a fundraising gala organized by one of the foundation's major donors. It was an intimidating prospect, standing before a room full of wealthy philanthropists, many of whom viewed him with skepticism due to the lingering rumors surrounding his marriage to Margaret. Ethan stood backstage, clutching Margaret's final letter in his pocket. He had read it countless times since her passing, drawing strength from her words. But tonight, they felt more important than ever. As the announcer introduced him, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "When I first met Margaret Whitmore, I was a desperate college student, drowning in debt and searching for a way to survive. What I didn't realize was that Margaret saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." He paused, scanning the faces in the audience. "She taught me that true wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. And she gave everything she had to create opportunities for people like me, people who dream of a better future but lack the means to achieve it." Ethan's voice wavered, but he pressed on. "This foundation isn't about me, and it's not even just about Margaret. It's about every person who dares to hope, every family that deserves a second chance, and every community that deserves to thrive." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Ethan barely noticed. He stepped off the stage feeling a mixture of relief and exhilaration. For the first time, he felt like he had truly done Margaret's memory justice. The gala raised more funds than any previous event, ensuring the foundation's projects would continue without interruption. The housing development was completed soon after, and Ethan attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony alongside the families who would be moving in. Watching their joy and gratitude, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment that no amount of money could ever provide. Yet, despite these successes, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The work was meaningful, but it also felt overwhelming, as though he were carrying the weight of Margaret's legacy alone. He began to realize that he needed support, not just from donors and volunteers, but from people who understood his journey and could share in it. One evening, as he sat in the greenhouse surrounded by Margaret's beloved orchids, Ethan decided to reach out to some of the scholarship recipients. He invited them to visit the Foundation's office, hoping to hear their stories and find inspiration in their journeys. The meeting exceeded his expectations. One by one, the recipients shared how the scholarships had changed their lives. Some had become doctors, others teachers, and a few had even started their own nonprofits to give back to their communities. Their stories reminded Ethan of why he had taken on this role in the first place and reignited his passion for the work. But the most surprising moment came when Clara, the nurse who had testified on behalf of the Foundation, approached him after the meeting. "You're doing an amazing job, Ethan," she said, her eyes earnest. "But you don't have to do it alone. If you ever need help, I'd be honored to work with you." Ethan was taken aback by her offer, but also deeply moved. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he felt like he had a partner, someone who shared his vision and understood the challenges he faced. Over the next few months, Clara became an integral part of the Foundation, helping Ethan expand its programs and reach even more people. Together, they launched new initiatives, including mentorship programs for at-risk youth and health clinics in underserved areas. The Foundation flourished, growing into a powerful force for good. As the year anniversary of Margaret's passing approached, Ethan decided to honor her memory with a special event, a celebration of her life and the impact she had made. The event was held at Margaret's Haven, the community center that had become the heart of the Foundation's work. Ethan stood before a crowd of families, donors, and scholarship recipients, feeling a mixture of sadness and pride. Margaret Whitmore was more than a philanthropist, he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. She was a visionary, a woman who believed in the power of hope and the strength of community. Everything we've accomplished is because of her. As he spoke, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. Margaret's legacy was alive, not just in the projects and programs her foundation had created, but in the lives she had touched and the hope she had inspired. And in that moment, he realized that her greatest gift wasn't the foundation or the opportunities it provided. It was the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples that changed the world. The celebration of Margaret's life marked a turning point for Ethan. Standing in front of the crowd at Margaret's Haven, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunity she had given him, but for the lessons she had taught him about resilience, hope, and the power of giving. As the event wound down, Ethan took a moment to step away from the crowd. He found himself in the greenhouse, the place where Margaret had spent so much of her time. The air was filled with the sweet scent of orchids, and he could almost hear her voice, reminding him to dream bigger, to be bold. He pulled out her final letter, which he carried with him everywhere, and read the last lines again. "Ethan, life isn't about what you take with you when you leave. It's about what you leave behind. Never forget that you have the power to create something lasting, something meaningful, and in doing so, you'll honor not just me, but yourself. With love, Margaret." Ethan smiled through the tears that blurred his vision. For so long he had doubted himself, his abilities, and his worth. But Margaret had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself, and now it was his responsibility to carry that forward. He returned to the crowd, joining Clara and a group of children who had come to the community center for its after-school programs. Their laughter and excitement filled the air, a testament to the impact of Margaret's vision. Ethan knelt beside a little girl who was drawing a picture of a house and asked her about it. "This is my dream house," she said brightly. "I want to build it someday." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He saw himself in her, the same spark, the same hope for a better future. And in that moment, he realized that Margaret's legacy wasn't just about the buildings or the scholarships. It was about inspiring others to dream, to believe in themselves, and to strive for something greater. As the sun set over the community center, Ethan stood with Clara, watching the families as they celebrated. The doubts and fears that had plagued him in the beginning had been replaced by a quiet confidence. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had the support of the community, the foundation, and the lessons Margaret had left him. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Ethan asked softly. Clara smiled. "I think she'd be more than proud. I think she'd be amazed." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Margaret's life had ended, but her impact was eternal, and as he looked out at the crowd, he knew that her belief in him would guide him for the rest of his life.